Welcome to the Making of Man. My name is Matthew Rodriguez, and today I will be talking to Matthew Plese about fasting and why you need to incorporate this age-old tradition into your spiritual practices. Matthew is a Third Order Dominican. He is the president of CatechismClass.com. He's a speaker and an author. In particular, he is the author of the book, The Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence, which will be the foundation of our conversation today. Links to Matthew's work can be found in the description below. Also below, you will find a color-coded calendar that you can use as a guide, as it shows the traditional days that people have fasted or abstained from certain foods. With all that said, we'll now dive into the conversation. Enjoy. Welcome, Matthew.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I thought we could start really foundationally, and I would just love to have you share a little bit about the importance of fasting in general. Why is it important that we fast?
So if you think about it, I wrote the book, The Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence. And in the book, I go through a number of things. And I start out with the importance of fasting. Why do we fast at all? Because you can learn about the history of what we've lost. And you can even have people tell you you should do it. But if you don't understand the purpose of it, you really lose the whole, initial first step. The purpose of fasting, of course, goes back to the very beginning of man, though. When we think about Adam and Eve in the garden and the first sin committed by our first parents, it was one of pride, but it was also one of gluttony. The first commandment of God was one of abstinence, not to eat one particular fruit. And our first parents couldn't do that. They could not observe the law of abstinence, so they gave into that. They gave into the greed and gluttony, and a lot of people focus on pride, but it was also the gluttony. They actually took it and they ate it. Fasting is a divine remedy. It is not only helping us physically, as I talk about as well in my book. There's a lot of physical benefits for anybody to fast, mental benefits as well, but it's full of spiritual benefits too, because when we consider it as the remedy to the first sin, and we go throughout all of history, we'll see that not only did our Lord fast, but he encouraged and he really mandated his disciples to fast. He said, when you fast, not if you do. It was really assumed that they would continue this tradition that was very robust in the Old Testament. We had a number of days of Jewish fasting that was observed by the faithful throughout the year, and the Christian church adopted this and continued it. There is no period in human history when fasting was not offered to the true God. So that's why we fast, because God wants us to fast, and it is a remedy to sin. It allows us to lift up our minds to contemplate heavenly things, and it allows us to bridle those lusts of the flesh. All those three reasons St. Thomas Aquinas talks about, and they're still as true today as they were 800 years ago. That's why we fast.
Awesome. And you mentioned kind of from Christ onwards, as far as the church has kind of taken fasting and put in recommendations. In the book, you cover the whole span of history, as you mentioned. If we could compile that into, kind of the narrative of just how fasting started and kind of how it transformed kind of over those centuries, I'm wondering if we could just give the audience just a brief kind of walkthrough of what fasting maybe used to have been and then what it currently is now and everything in between.
Right. So people are generally shocked when I give talks on this or I appear on shows or when I write on this and I remind people and I show them that if you were to take a calendar and you were to mark up the days of what fasting and abstinence used to be practiced by our forefathers at really the height of Christendom, you would be fasting 1/3 of the year, and you would be abstaining from meat 2/3 of the year. Because every day that was a day of fasting was also a day of abstinence, but there were other days of abstinence. When you added them up, the majority of the year you are doing a penance that, for the most part, was also obligatory. It wasn't even just here's recommended days. There were long periods of time where these were very obligatory. They were not just recommended. So if you did not observe them and you were bound to, you committed a mortal sin. So the church mandated these, and many of these for so long, and the faithful still did sometimes more than the actual minimum. So what is it? So in the very beginning of the church, our Lord obviously started the church. He is the founder of the church. And his disciples, the apostles, were ones who very early on began to observe and teach, and the faithful as well observed the fast. So the fasting in the early church was twofold. It was the weekly devotional fast. So you had Wednesdays and you had Fridays all year long. Days of fasting, and if it's a day of fasting, it's a day you don't have meat either, because meat is considered an item of luxury. You give away those sorts of foods on days we eat more simple. But then two, the Lenten fast as well. The Lenten fast, as catechisms attest to, as church fathers attest to, began with the apostles themselves. And very early on, the fast that was the Lenten fast was practiced by catechumens, those preparing to enter the church, those being called from paganism, and they going through this period, and then they would be received into the church. And very early on, many of the other faithful wanted to observe these, fasting periods as well. So Lent, over a quick period of time, really began to become the 40 days we know of as Lent. And it was characterized by fasting, and the very end of it, which was Holy Week, the more intense fast, because very early on it was just kind of Holy Week was the fast. And then, like I said, over the time of the apostles and their immediate successors, Lent took shape, and that was very early on what the church did for fasting. But even if you go to shortly after the 200s, we have days like Ember Days being observed with a lot of rigor. Those were days when all the seasons changed. You have the Wednesdays, you have the Fridays, and you have the Saturdays. And these were days of fasting and abstinence, days to consecrate to God the fruit of the earth, to pray for vocations to the priesthood. It really connected man back with land and allowed him to render thanks to God for the gifts he had been given. And like I said, that was around the year 200 or so. But it had its roots in the Old Testament, so that it became mandatory then. And then the church also began to observe fasting and different vigils as well, those days before great feast days. And that continued, and that characterized fasting for a very long time. There were other days, though. So by the year like 480, for instance, parts of the world began to observe a fast leading up to Christmas that would become known as the Nativity Fast in some places, the Advent Fast in others, and some places called it St. Martin's Lent, because it eventually began on the day after St. Martin of Tours feast day, which falls on November 11th. So November 12th on, you would fast up until Christmas. And that would be really a second Lent in the year. Of course, fasting was never practiced on Sundays, though. Abstinence was in some places, like for instance in Lent it was, but never Sundays. And then you had things like the period of fasting leading up to Assumption Day in August, practiced in ancient times as well, and a period of fasting in June as well, preparing for the Apostles' feast days. So you had these major fasting periods, and then you had the devotional fasts of Wednesdays and Fridays. And they kind of just stayed around for a long time. And the last thing I'll add is some places there was always some sort of regional differences too. So, for instance, before the Nativity fast became more widespread, it was practiced really in just certain areas. It was instituted by St. Perpetuus in his area around Gaul. Similarly, some places observed the devotional fast on Saturdays as well. For instance, Rome was in one of those places. So, when the faithful, for instance, of Northern Europe would go to Rome, they would initially be surprised. Why are these people fasting, abstaining on Saturdays? And that's where the old adage is, when you're in Rome, do as the Romans do, comes in, because they were like, should I fast today or not? We don't normally fast where we come from on Saturdays. And so they were told, well, in Rome, you do as the Romans do. And that's where the origin of that saying comes in. So, but not every place practiced Saturdays. So there was some sort of difference. And as the centuries go on, we can talk about it more later, but it just kind of fell apart. You had other areas that kind of turned that devotional Wednesdays and Fridays, changed that. Eventually, well, not fasting, it can just be abstinence. And eventually, Wednesdays altogether by the 10th century were kind of lost as year-round days of penance, except some places like Ireland kept it to the 17th century. So some places are keeping it longer. And then by the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, what it meant for abstinence was also different. If it was Lent, it was a different kind of abstinence than the other days. You know, you couldn't have dairy, you couldn't have eggs, you couldn't have any animal products. Otherwise, absent just means no meat. So there was a divergence at that point. So even in modern America, I'll skip over all those centuries because you could talk for an hour on this. But by 1741, that was the first time ever you could have meat in Lent when Pope Benedict XIV changed it. So you're talking about 1700 years. Lent means no meat whatsoever. That was a radical change. But even in early America, we had more fasting and abstinence as we did now. So, for instance, one thing I mentioned to people that is initially very surprising is Saturdays were days of mandatory abstinence here in America until like the 1830s. So for several decades in America's history, early America kept that same practice as well. And after that change, you just had really Fridays remaining for abstinence. But you also had in Advent, you had Wednesdays and Fridays in Advent were days of fasting and abstinence also in early America too, and that went away. And eventually, what most people think of as traditional fasting, they look at what we have now and they're like, I want to be more traditional. I'll follow what was done in 1917 when 1917 Code of Canon Law came out under St. Pius X, and they'll see, oh, okay, you got year-round Friday abstinence, okay. You have Ember Days each season. I'll make sure to observe those with fasting and abstinence. I got vigils, so the day before Assumption Day, the day before Christmas Eve, that is, day before All Saints Day, etc. There was like 4 or 5 of them, and those are going to be observed as fasting and abstinence. And then you have all of Lent. All 40 days of Lent, all weekdays, not including Sundays, are days of fasting and abstinence, and beforehand, even the Sundays of Lent were days of absence. But people think that's what tradition is, because that's what was in the 1970 Code of Canon Law. But if you study the history, you'll see we went from, like I said, 2/3 of the year of absence and 1/3 of fasting to that. And that's a reduction. And then when you skip over all these changes that occurred too in the 1900s, it wasn't just here's 1917 and here's 1960 and it's gone. There were changes too over this period of time slowly. And nowadays, what do we have? We have people think you only need to fast on Good Friday and Ash Wednesday, and you only need to abstain during Lent. And that's also not true. I mean, even the 1983 Code of Canon Law talks around year-round Friday abstinence. So people aren't even taught about that. People have lost the whole history of it. So when we talk about why we fast, it goes back to the Old Testament, but the church adopted the practice, legislated it. It can and does change over time. But what we've done now is we've watered it down to such an extent that people and modern man no longer understand the importance of this, that this was a true remedy for conquering sins of the flesh, for making reparation for sins for yourselves and for your family, for really building virtue. So many benefits for year-round fasting, year-round abstinence too, that it can not only be one part of the year. It is as essential to living a Catholic life as Sunday Masses. So you can't think fasting's not for me. If you're listening and you're a man who can fast, fasting is for you. So you have to rediscover some of this. And that's why I tell people, don't just do it haphazardly. What did our forefathers do for centuries and centuries? And let's look there, and that's how we can pick it up. But that's still a very short overview of the history. There's a lot of changes, but as you can see, it just kind of really accelerated downhill from around the time of the Renaissance to present.
And when you had a fasting day, what specifically did that look like? I know in the book you talked that it's kind of different from Lent and like other times, but yeah, if you could kind of just go through some of those options of, okay, you're waking up, it's a Wednesday, it's a Friday, it's a day in Lent, like what do you do on that day to fast?
Right. So that also differs over time. So in the very early church, if it's a fasting day, of course it means no meat's allowed, but it also means you're only having one meal, and that one meal is had after sunset only. So you're going to wait all day till after sunset, that you're going to have your meal, and that's it. And it's going to be a vegan meal, because abstinence very early on wasn't just vegetarian, it was vegan. And that went on really until the 6th century. So by that time, in the 6th century, you have Pope St. Gregory the Great changing what absence means, and you can have fish for the first time. So it's important to note that, I think, because so many people, I think, allege sorts of lies against the church, that the church, allows fish on Fridays because it enriched itself early on because the apostles were fishermen, and that's how they became so wealthy. I mean, that's just absurd. Because for 6 centuries, you could not even have fish most of the year as part of this. So that's just outright debunked right there. But that's how fasting was done for a long time. By the year 817, you have monks for the first time ever that they could start to have something called a collation, another snack that eventually was just liquid like wine. And then it turned into, well, it could be like a morsel of bread. And this was for the monks because if you're aware of, like the book, How the Church Built Western Civilization, monks aren't just sitting around praying all day. They're out in the field working all the time. They're heavily manual labor, and they're cultivating the land, and they're Christianizing Europe, but they're also doing everything that we see now of building Europe physically. So they are allowed this refreshment in the evening. And then that begins to spread to the faithful. And this is kind of how it was practiced for a long time. By the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, then you had a little bit different of what time the meal could be had, though. So by this point, the meal time was moved up to 3 o'clock in honor of that was the hour in which Christ died. So if it was a fasting day, you could have it at 3 o'clock for the most part. And you could have that second snack, collation, just a small amount in the evening. Definitely by the time of St. Alphonsus Liguori, around the 17th century or so, you have the practice in some places of you could have a small morning snack as well called a frustula. And, together those should be quite small. Remember, your main meal is had at noon, but by that point, we can move it up. At 3, by this point, let's move it up and have it at noon. So your meal time is now moved to noon. You can have these other 2 snacks. By the time of America, unlike the Baltimore Council here, people familiar with the Baltimore Catechism, but the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in their manual even published guidelines for you should weigh these to make sure they're not too much. That's how much strictness the church was looking at this, to make sure, make sure that collation snack isn't too large. Weigh it. It should be no more than 8 ounces. And the morning one should be no more than 2 ounces. And there were also rules regarding what you could have. So, for instance, you couldn't have butter because butter would be an animal product. But maybe you could have chocolate. I talk about it in the book when chocolate was discovered in the New World. There was a debate: is it a liquid or a solid? If I leave it out, it melts, but it freezes here. And there was debate on whether or not the chocolate could be had with the frustula. And all of this is said because people for a long time took fasting and abstinence very seriously. So the question of, is this meat or not, is this allowed, was very serious a question. Is this too much food or not, was seriously considered. That's why these manuals are put out. That's why we have these guidelines. That's why moral theologians are talking about this. Not because it doesn't matter, because it matters a lot. Because to intentionally violate the laws of fast and abstinence is a mortal sin. And I feel like priests nowadays are hesitant to remind people that was affirmed by multiple popes and taught without hesitation, that the church's precepts, the going to Mass on Sundays, for instance, the observance of the church's laws on marriage, of an Eastertide communion, and of, fasting and abstinence, that these all bind mortally. So if you are obliged to fast, you are in the ages that you have to fast, and you physically can, then yes, to fail to do so is a mortal sin. You must go to confession. So, you risk your own soul going to hell for eternity, because the church has the power by Christ to command this. And that's something I also talk about too in my writing, especially in the book, because I find the history very interesting, but it's important to understand too, the church has this authority because Christ gave it to her. And unlike some people that allege we avoid certain foods because they're evil, because, for instance, some pagan religions taught evil demons would hide in certain foods. Like you would avoid meat because demons were in there, so by eating it, then you ingested a demon. That's not the case at all. The sin is the disobedience, because a legitimate authority in the church says you may not consume this thing on this day or at this time. That's the violation. And because we do not observe that, that's why it becomes a mortal sin. So important to keep that in mind too, that it all comes down to obedience. And obviously men, of course, we should be the most obedient to God. That's the first priority, the observance of the commandments of God and the commandments of the church, also known as the precepts. That comes number one. And then after that, you can focus on, how to sanctify my family life. How do I balance my work life commitments? How do I make time for other things? That ordering of responsibilities in the home has to always be subordinated to the laws of God and the laws of the church. So understanding what the church teaches regarding fasting and abstinence is very important, because we have to observe these laws. They do bind under penalty of sin. The same would be applied to with the Eucharistic fast for Holy Communion. A lot of consideration was paid to what do I eat? I mean, what can I eat? What can I drink? What can I not? So much so, like, even theologians would be like, because for a long time I'll tell people, really until the 1950s, you could not eat or drink anything before Holy Communion from midnight on. And that was the case for centuries and centuries. But people would be like, well, I'm getting an IV, like I'm taking in liquid through an IV. Does that violate the fast? People were very seriously concerned about things like this. Or I accidentally swallowed my tooth when I'm sleeping. Did I eat? Can I go to Holy Communion today? Of course, the faithful didn't receive communion as often back then. Especially before Pius X's time in early 1900s. But so this was all kind of considered, all going back to, it's important to understand the history. Things change. People want to, of course, observe what the church commands. But unfortunately, through it all, there does tend to be, especially over the centuries, a minimalism that emerges. People are intent on, well, what do I have to do? I want to make sure I observe it, but I'm just going to make sure I don't commit a sin. And we've reached the point now where we have so little fasting and abstinence that we have to say the minimum is beyond easy. I want to go above and beyond the minimum. I want to put myself, so to speak, back in these early eras and try to observe the fast as if I lived then. And then I will reap benefits from doing so. I do so voluntarily, but I unite myself to my ancestors who did so under obligation. And I'll use that as a roadmap to how to sanctify my own life with fasting and abstinence. So that's what I encourage people to do. We learn it not just for history lesson, not because it's just interesting. We want to know where phrases like "when in Rome, do as Rome do" come from. We do this because this is the roadmap for us to how to become holy in this particular century.
Mm-hmm. Thinking through the obligation that you mentioned, and even with that in there, I know that there is the instinct to kind of ask, okay, maybe there were prolific writing saints that discussed this, or maybe, right, there were these moral theologians either in monasteries or later in the church's history at universities that were discussing this. But I know that there is an instinct to kind of question, but how really was this followed? Did the people actually do this? This might be the documents that kind of came out of the time, but was this really followed? And I wonder if you could kind of talk to those kind of doubts or those questions of if we have kind of more evidence of the truly kind of common peasant working class people that they were actually kind of going through in this, they were eating once a day in Lent and things like that. If you could kind of speak to that.
Yeah, so there's no doubt that the faithful did so throughout the centuries. One thing I'll note is that we have examples in testimony for some of the martyrs and how they observed the fasting. So I talk about in the book that in the very early church, you could not even have water on a fasting day until you broke your fast after sunset with your meal. And there's testimonies of a bishop who was martyred in Spain. And I think it's really prolific to consider what he went through with these tortures, but he's being led to execution. And he's being offered a drink. And this wasn't even during Lent. This was during a weekly devotional fast on a Wednesday or a Friday. And he refuses the drink because he said it was not the hour to break the fast. And he would break the fast in heaven because he would not have any water whatsoever and violate the law of the church. So, I mean, obviously, people now be like, obviously there's some sort of circumstances that permit you to not have to observe this. But he didn't, and we have that testimony as well. And we looked through a lot of older catechisms, and I did so. There were all these questions on who is exempt and dispensed from the law of fasting and abstinence. And there's different categories of people, from those who had too much physical labor to pregnant and nursing women to the sick and infirm. And what does it mean to be too sick and infirm to actually observe these laws? But the fact that you had all these people asking about this and writing about this show people generally were interested in whether or not they were dispensed or not. And also, obviously, that fasting began at a certain age and ended at a certain age. Absence began at a certain age, but never ended. It would go for the end of your life, and still is the case. So when you are bound by absence, you are bound for the rest of your life. Doesn't mean at 85, 90 years old, you still cannot eat meat on a prohibited day. You might be exempt from fasting, though, but some people who are still even legitimately exempted would still continue to observe it. So we see this as well in the evidence of these catechisms and writings. We see it as well clearly in church history, because as I document in the book, the death of fasting and absence was death by 1,000 dispensations. If people didn't care and they broke it anyway, they wouldn't be like, I want a dispensation, for this area or for this region or for this particular thing, and we want to latch on to that and use it. And that's what people did over centuries. That's how fasting and absence was weakened. As we talk about before, what does it mean to be meat? Gregory the Great allowed fish, but eventually we have muskrat being allowed, beaver being allowed in certain places, puffin being allowed, capybara being allowed. Things you look at and you're like, that's not a fish, but your dispensations offered. Dispensations for crusaders offered. Dispensations for family members if the father's a sailor or in the army and it's in a wartime. So that way he maybe would be dispensed, but the family wouldn't, but that would be unbecoming, that they wouldn't be able to eat together. So we're going to issue dispensation for all of them. All of these are a preponderance of evidence to show that people generally saw these out and they were granted by the Holy See, or the Holy See gave authority to bishops who then could issue these dispensations. So that's very clear as well. And thirdly, we can definitely see this was the case too in the food customs. So in another book that I wrote on restoring the lost customs of Christendom, which I published last December, one of those customs throughout all these different liturgical seasons usually centers around food. And if we look at like the food customs, for instance, during Eastertide now, after Lent has ended, they're just full of different meat dishes and egg dishes and things that people were otherwise not able to eat. Whereas the food customs, for instance, in Lent were mainly over things like pretzels, things that were entirely vegan. Or traditionally on St. Joseph's Day, it was not Zeppelis people would have, which is more of a modern thing, with obviously dairy products in there. Traditionally, it was things like sawdust pasta, which was breadcrumbs and other things entirely vegan. And St. Joseph's tables were vegan for a long period of time, too. So if we look at the food customs people observed, they were observing the laws of the church as well. And society went along with it, too. I talk about in the book that it was a crime, for instance, to eat or serve meat in certain places on Friday. Rightfully so, because the civil authority wanted to ensure that souls were being saved, too. So it was an offense civilly to do so. And this remained the case even in Anglican England for a while. There were royal proclamations against eating of meat on prohibited days. And we even see modern society going along with it. That's why, thankfully, we still see Friday specials for fish and vegetarian items now. And that's really because of the influence of Catholics. Of course, Catholics are why McDonald's had the fish sandwich, because they lost all the money on Friday. Then nobody was coming to their stores, so they decided in the 50s to put a fish sandwich on the menu. And that is the impact Catholics can have. But the food traditions alone, too, are very clear. So there's a lot of reasons we can look at to say, like, was this just published and nobody did it? No, people cared about the faith. They lived the faith. If you call yourself a Catholic, you have to observe the Catholic faith. We obviously have our shortcomings. We have confession there if we mess up, but you can't just say, I'll be Catholic and this is not important, I'm not going to bother observing it. That's as ludicrous as saying I'll be a Catholic, but I don't have to go to Mass on Sundays. I'll go whenever I want. That is not the case. That's the same as violating intensely some of the commandments. We strive to always do better, but there is no reality in which we can say that these don't apply to us. The commandments of God and the church apply to everybody who the church says they do.
Mm-hmm. This might be a little bit of a tangent, but you mentioned the cultural impact that fasting has had on people or businesses kind of changing what food they offer. And I thought it was really funny. You mentioned in the book the ability to affect climate, even if enough Catholics were fasting, that I just thought would be I don't know if the right word is ironic, but just in today's modern political landscape, if Catholics all of a sudden became the kind of greatest force for or against climate change, what people look for as far as those markers for climate change, just because for 40 days out of the year we cut down our meat consumption to very, very minimal.
Well, even more than that, you got to add in the Fridays as well throughout the year. So when there were studies done, when the bishops in England and Wales said that it's absolutely required here, it was what, 2011, absolutely required now. Fridays throughout the year, no meat for Catholics. No other exceptions. That's the rule here in England and Wales. And there were studies done to show that decent amount of Catholics went along with that and said, okay, I guess that's the rule. So we're gonna do that. And there were studies done to show the amount of emissions not generated. A lot of people who are into climate advocacy talk about going vegetarian, for instance, because of the impact, like, for instance, cows especially have on the environment. Well, if the church outright mandated or returned to these practices of fasting and abstinence, that I have no doubt that it would, significantly reduce these climate impacts. So that's interesting. That I wish more people at the Vatican, who seem more interested sometimes in discussions around that than on restoring traditional practices and the faith, that they're not latching onto that, because these studies done by secular institutions show the benefit that society would actually have by less meat consumption, and we have a roadmap to do that, because that's what our forefathers did too. And not only that too, like when you don't have meat for a long period of time, you look forward to it. It tastes better. You appreciate it. So there's a lot of benefits for sure. Physical benefits too, mental benefits, not just spiritual benefits. Of course, those are significant. A lot of people, you could look online to find out all these great resources and people telling you should do intermittent fasting and the benefits of that. Well, I mean, the church has been onto this topic for a long time too, but the church isn't just only concerned about the body, it's concerned about the soul. So obviously you have both, but there are definitely physical benefits. A lot of people in America, I think, would stand to lose weight, and if one of the reasons they could do so is fasting, because it's easy to cheat on a diet because you're just cheating yourself. Who cares? I'll just have a little this, a little that. It won't matter. I'll make it up later. God sees everything. So when it's a fast, you can't eat. There is no exceptions getting around it. So it adds that extra layer of accountability. So this is a way too for us to get physically healthier too. So God really provides us through the church not only these great spiritual benefits, of which there are many, and those should be the number one goal, but these other tangential benefits of mental acuity, of physical benefits too, health-wise, of preventing certain diseases, of losing weight and getting healthier, of finding more time in the day to pray and other things. Because people talk about you don't have time to pray, you don't have time to do things with your family. Well, if you're not eating, well, you got all the extra time too. You don't have time for work. Well, guess what? You have a lot more time now too. And I will say it will be hard if somebody's listening to this and thinking, well, this is probably pretty hard. It might be hard for the first few days, but then after that, it's amazing what the body can do and how it adjusts, and how after the first few days, you're going to be a lot better, or at least after the first week. Same thing with you getting into an exercise routine. You go in the gym, you might think, wow, I'm really sore after the first few. It's really hard. After time goes on, you're like, well, I'm getting the hang of this. I'm getting into the rhythm of this. Even secular studies show it takes on average 21 days to develop a habit. That's why so many people have New Year's resolutions and they drop them and they don't observe them because they don't keep it for at least 3 weeks or 21 days. If you develop the habit of fasting and abstinence, after 21 days, it's going to feel quite natural, definitely by that point, and you're going to want to do it. And it's going to feel good. So there's so much to be said about, yes, those environmental benefits, health ones too. If people just habitualize it and don't give up the first time they say, like, wow, this is hard. Like, I don't know if I've ever felt hunger, before. It's okay. You press through it. And it's good to feel hungry because it also brings us in solidarity and charity with those who are in the world who legitimately are living in poverty, who might not have food. So we can always think about them too when we're hurting in a fasting period, and offer it up for them too.
When looking at the history of the church and also looking at the holidays, or if you look at the history of the church and history of work, you find all these kind of celebrations. And I was wondering if you could talk about how to kind of layer on fasting on top of that, because in today's time, when we think of a celebration, we think of a feast. But it almost doesn't seem compatible with the amount of celebrations that they've had. There's wide ranges, but I've seen some say like half the year, there was some Saints Day or some, celebration or whatever that you were doing, but also looking at it with the fasting that around, a large part, like you said, like kind of 2/3 of the year, you're doing something. So when people did these celebrations, was fasting still kind of incorporated into that, like, as well?
So there is no direct contradiction between celebration and penance. So we see that, for instance, and this is shocking to most modern Catholics because they're not taught it, is that Sundays in Lent were days of penance. They were days of mandatory abstinence until the end of the 1800s, really under Pope Leo XIII. And people always think, oh, it's Sunday, it's like incompatible with penance. And that is not true. I mean, we still kneel at the consecration on Sundays, even though some say kneeling is a form of penance. There's nothing wrong with abstaining on Sundays. And the case is also true throughout the year. For instance, during Lent, the Lenten fast, what people always say, like, oh, it's St. Patrick's Day. Is it still a fasting day? It's St. Joseph's Day. It's Annunciation Day. Yes, it's Lent. All of Lent is a day of fasting. All of these. And these questions go back to people wanting dispensations and exceptions because they don't want to do as much penance. There is certainly a way you can celebrate even in the middle of penance. As I talked about before, these St. Joseph tables, these large, beautiful tables with all this food, they happen to be vegetarian for a long time. And you could still celebrate, but you did so while abstaining. Now, throughout the year, there are traditionally were a number of holy days of obligations you talked about. There were actually there was an official list made in 1642, and that list listed 35 days. And in addition, one of the 35th one was the patrons of your city, country, nation, etc. So it could be a little bit more than 35. But yeah, beforehand, there were actually even a little bit more, because if you look on that list, the Triduum's not on that list. If you look on that list, not all of Holy Week is on that list. So if you go back beforehand, there were even 45 days. But all that to be said, that these were days in which the faithful had to go to Mass. But nowadays, when we talk about holy days of obligation, it means going to Mass and resting from servile work. Same thing on Sundays. For a long period of time, there was a difference between days of single and double precept. If it was a day of double precept, that applied. But sometimes it was just single precept, which means you had to go to Mass, but you can still work afterwards. And there was a whole tables made for different countries. I have one on Ireland, for instance, to show how that changed over the centuries. But that doesn't mean you can't celebrate the day and still work. There was still that element in some places, because remember, the church, this goes to the church's precepts. The church can change and alter precepts over time, but she should do so only carefully and for the good of souls. But that shows how that's possible. Same thing too with, like you said, fasting and absence. There is no direct contradiction. There's certain times where it's not as befitting. So we're in Paschaltide, after as we celebrate Easter. And during this particular period, it's not really appropriate to do a lot of fasting. But I will say April 25th is the major rogation day. And that is a day which can observe at least abstinence. I encourage people to do so because that's a day of processions as well. And then the days immediately before Ascension Thursday were the minor rogation days. And the third minor rogation day is always the Vigil of the Ascension, which has some sort of penitential aspects too. So these could be days we observe as days of abstinence. And of course, all Fridays are still days of mandatory abstinence too. So just because it's Paschaltide doesn't mean that you should not do penance. That's not the case. Even before the changes in the 1970 Code of Canon Law under Pope St. Pius X, if it was a holy day of obligation and a Friday, you still had to observe Friday abstinence, even on a holy day of obligation. The only exception was Christmas, which went back to the Middle Ages, but that only started around the time of St. Francis. So the church's history shows us that you can still celebrate, you can still have these great feast days, and that does not necessarily mean fasting and abstinence are abrogated in and of themselves without a different dispensation, because we need fasting and abstinence. Modern man needs it more than maybe any period in history. So rather than looking at, is there an exception? Do I have to do that? We should look at these voluntary days. So I've talked a lot about obligatory, but the voluntary ones, we should look at those as I should just still do so. So I observe year-round Saturday abstinence because that was observed for a very long period of time, and I do so voluntarily. And I'm still doing so this month. I will continue to do so, not because I have to, because I feel like I continue to need to do that. And it is a way for me to connect with my forefathers too, and with the church in heaven, and is a way to make continual penance throughout the year.
I think for fathers specifically, having a calendar like that is super helpful because in terms of how to order your house or organize your house and kind of lead your house throughout the year, today, at least from my experience and talking to other men who are fathers, it can kind of feel like you're making it up as you go along. And so it's cool to have a calendar that the church, either kind of has given in the past, like we're talking, as in today's kind of church, not all of these are obligatory, but that has given in the past that you can just use, as your template that you bring your family along. So you don't have to make it up as you go, which I think is a really powerful support in helping connect the universal church to the domestic church and kind of create that shared Catholic culture between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, our Lord said some demons are driven out only by prayer and fasting. So people talk about the demons facing the modern world now, people struggling with many different things. Fasting is a remedy against so much of this. And St. Basil the Great taught that our guardian angels were going to be closer to us really in proportion to our fasting. You could talk, for an hour about what the church fathers, at least an hour, on the amount of benefits that you could gain from fasting. So people should want to fast. They should want to do more. Doesn't matter if Lent's ended. There are plenty of fasting days the rest of the year. Obviously, year-round Friday absence, but think about adding Wednesdays too. Think about adding Saturdays. Get that calendar out. Understand Ember Days still come around throughout the year. You have periods of fasting, for instance, 2 weeks before Assumption Day in August. Great time for us to take a break from summer to really focus on preparing for the Assumption. We have the Great Fast leading up to Christmas, which ended in the Roman Church quite a long time ago, really before the 1400s, but was practiced roughly 1,000 years before that. So there's great things we can do to voluntarily go back, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. So every year I publish a little calendar, a picture of which, as well as a one you can actually download and incorporate in your phone or your apps or your Outlook, for instance. And this is what kind of robust fasting would look like had our forefathers been here to practice it now. Here's the days of fasting and abstinence with different categories. That's what I personally do. And I just make it available because I think that was the great roadmap. Because why should you be like, I want to fast and abstain more. What should I do? I see some places, advertising, like Meatless Monday specials. Like that's just a secular thing, for alliteration. How about obviously Meatless Fridays, but what about Meatless Wednesdays too? Because that's the day our Lord was betrayed. Or Meatless Saturdays, because why was Saturdays days of absence for a long time? Because that was the day our Lord still lay in the tomb dead. So these are the days of penance for the Christian. So that's what we should do. You want to cut down your meat consumption? People eat too much meat anyway. Those are the days to cut it down. I mean, you could add more too, but that's what you would start at. And I go through in the book all those great traditions, even in the Eastern Catholics, like the Armenians and the Byzantine, etc. And there's so much to be said by the example that some of these Eastern Catholics still keep to this day. So we can use some of that too as a roadmap. But yeah, don't reinvent the wheel. There's calendars out there that, for instance, I publish that people can use and hopefully use it to incorporate these elements and help you in your journey.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll have a link to the current calendar in the description below. As part of that, I don't know if you made this, but you have in the book the St. Nicholas Fellowship. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I thought that gave a really good tiered approach to getting into fasting. I thought it was very compassionate, that it didn't just kind of force you into the deep end right in the beginning and kind of allowed you to wade in. And so I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that and how to follow that.
So yes, I did make the Fellowship of St. Nicholas. And I also did it from my own experience too, because while I try to observe the strictest, I try to make my Lent, for instance, harder every year too. That's one thing I try to do. Like this year was the first year that I only had my meal after sunset. So that was the addition this year. But, God willing, I tell people I hope every Lent is a little bit harder, because eventually over time it gets a little easy. Even if you're like, wow, this is already way harder than this. Like you want to intensify it. You want to do more prayer, fasting, and almsgiving every single year for as long as you're alive. And so I try to make mine harder too. So all that to be said, it's not like I went from nothing to this calendar overnight. So the calendar that I'm glad you're going to link to that, because I think it could be really helpful for people, but the calendar really goes with tier 3 of the group. So I made the group along with my publisher. So the Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence that I wrote is published by Our Lady of Victory Press. And Our Lady of Victory Press is led by Timothy Flanders, who is the editor of 1 Peter 5. So the 1 Peter 5 website hosts the Fellowship of St. Nicholas. So we are an online Telegram group of people who have committed to observe one of these tiers. There's 3 tiers. And we're here to support each other, to ask questions. If people have not sure, like, is this day of fasting or not? How is this practice? What are some recipes should I have? What should I do in this particular situation regarding hunger here? Or I'm interacting with family members here. What should I do? Like all kinds of practical questions like that. And I provide resources too on articles I write on fasting and the church tradition, etc. But it's a group anybody can join. And if you go to 1peter5.com/fast, I mentioned that in the book, but that's the webpage for it. It lists 3 different tiers. And these are kind of the tiers I suggest. So if you're kind of new to this, I would suggest at least, starting with tier 1. And tier 1 basically says this is the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Take that as a minimum. And it makes a couple changes. So basically what this means is no meat at all on any Friday of the year with no exceptions. No meat for all of Lent from Ash Wednesday through Holy Saturday. No meat on any of the Ember days, on a handful of vigils like the Vigil of Saints Peter and Paul, the Assumption, All Saints, the Immaculate Conception, Christmas Eve, Vigil of Pentecost, as well as January 22nd, which is the National Day of Penance for Human Life here in America. That kind of what the abstinence is. And fasting is, of course, 1 meal a day that may not be consumed earlier than noon, but consumed preferably at 3 o'clock. And tier 1 says fasting is going to be observed for all of Lent, except Sundays, all Ember days, and those vigils, and January 22nd that I mentioned. That's the minimum. And then, too, if you scroll to the bottom of the page, there's a link to the Telegram group so you can join. So if you're like, I can do at least that, and I think everybody can, because that was practiced under obligation, really until 100 years ago or so. And that was actually watered down to that stage. So really, if you're a Catholic man, you can do that. That's the minimum. Now, tier 2 is everything in tier 1, but no flesh meat is going to be consumed on any Saturday of the year unless it was formerly or currently a holy day of obligation or first class feast. All of Lent as well is going to be vegan. So you're going to abstain from all seafood, all fish, all eggs, all dairy products, making it vegan. You're also going to have the absence on the minor and major rogation days that occur in Paschaltide. And no meat is to be consumed, and all for the Nativity fast, that's St. Martin's Lent, which starts before the liturgical season of Advent. So November 12th to Christmas Day, no meat at all, except Sundays, except the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, unless it falls on a Friday. And we made an exception too for Thanksgiving Day for people in America, because it's important to come together as a family that day. And fasting is same as, like I said, tier 1, except we're adding in the fast of all of St. Martin's Lent. So that's tier 2. And tier 3, if you can do tier 3, if you can do tier 2, you basically can do tier 3, because it's the exact same thing as the previous tiers. We're just adding in maybe a handful of more vigils throughout the year, like the vigil before Our Lady's Purification Day, the vigil of Corpus Christi, the vigil of some of the apostles, etc. And those are going to be days of fasting and absence. So that's kind of how you work it in over time. But you can do more than that too. So even if you're in tier 3, like I am, and you can say, well, fasting is no meal before noon, because that's what the church always said, preferably at 3. I'm going to wait till after sunset. You can do that. You can choose to make it harder. Some people in the fellowship group this year are going, this Lent went without water until sunset, because after hearing the story of what the martyrs did, they chose they're not going to consume any water either. Especially, they say, like, if Muslims can do so during Ramadan, and then they have their meal and party at night, who are we, who follow the true God, the triune God? How should we have an easier time? So we're going to go without water until our meal too. So there's ways you can add these additional extras too. You can focus so much on fasting and absence was practiced this way with this kind of harshness, and people did so. People observed it, but then people would do more than that even. The notion now of people giving up things for Lent is they would give up things in addition to this. So, for instance, they would give up alcohol was a common one, or you would give up tobacco products as an extra one, or you would give up all desserts at all, even if they were vegan. You wouldn't have them. You wouldn't go to parties, for instance, on fasting days or all of Lent. So if there was a birthday, we're going to move that celebration, because it's just not befitting that during this period of penance. And bishops and priests used to talk about that very much. Not appropriate to go to festivals or concerts, during this time. So living liturgically is something more and more Catholics should do, and we need to do it in the home. So men can definitely lead by example. I've seen firsthand the amount of people who have adopted this, and their families followed them. The men who were like, no, like, we want to be holier. People did all of this for so long. Who are we not to do something a little bit more, at least tier 1? And then the rest of the family follows along too. Same thing too with children. Some fathers say, I don't want my children eating meat on Fridays at all, even if they aren't of the age yet that they even have to. I want to start them off early, because this is part of our family penance, and I want them to understand this and understand how important this is. So there's certain things that we can do, even if, for instance, children don't have to fast because they're under the age of fasting. But St. Thomas Aquinas talks about some children might be obliged morally to fast, because if you're old enough to sin, you're probably old enough to fast. So if you have high school children who are not obliged to, they still certainly might want to. And you, as the father, might make the determination of, I think we should, do some fasting, and work with the priest too on that. So there's a lot of things to consider, and I wish more people understood the benefits of fasting to see how it is really a remedy. So I hope people feel inspired and called to observe more fasting and absence, and understand that if you're in the state of grace, you can do this and offer it up just like you would any prayer, and thus it becomes meritorious. And you talk about, people talk about family problems and everything. Well, this is a way you can actually make reparation for sin, and you can offer for God, and you can offer for your family, for your children, or your parents, or your siblings, or your spouse, or your neighbors. So much so, it is very powerful. You can offer for your priest too. I gave a whole conference once on the benefits of offering this for priests, because priests, need prayers, but they also need fasting. So the remedies of the world can really be helped if more people return to fasting. Uh, One of the last things I'll note is remember our Lord himself fasted. And the fathers even say he literally ate nothing for 40 days. And, think about it. We don't literally eat nothing. We're allowed a meal too each day. But if God himself could fast, who is anybody else to say he doesn't have to fast or he's only going to do the minimum? Because God, who does not need to fast, fasted for us and for our example. So I hope we follow him.
Yeah. No, that's great. And just a clarification, what is the age that fasting kicks in
Well,
for
that also
kids?
changed. That also changed over time. I believe it's 18 now, but it used to be 21.
Okay.
It was changed to 18 in the the 60s, or was it 83? One of those. Relatively recently. But I say anybody 18 on needs to fast. And even in the Middle Ages, like I say, St. Thomas Aquinas talked about that at age 10 you might have to fast. Remember, people are getting married too. At that period of 14, 15 years old or so. Some of these
Mm-hmm.
are going out and fighting in the Crusades, and they don't have to fast under law for years more. They thought that was kind of strange that you might have this whole life and not have to fast yet. So, something to keep in mind that even if you're not, like I said, obliged under the law, that you should still, you might need to because of your
Mm-hmm.
sins too. Especially if you struggle with certain sins, fasting is a great remedy of those, especially for sins against the flesh. Fasting is the main remedy for that. So if children, especially those in high school, adolescence age, struggle with that, then that's something that they should really be looking at more to do so in a way that is healthy and safe, but understanding that that has been a remedy for all of Christianity, fasting against those sins.
Mm-hmm. And I think that gives a great, the end, right? Like the end is not just to fast. It's a means
Right,
to an end to be more charitable, to be more conformed in your life to Christ, who, as you mentioned, fasted
right.
and suffered other things. And so,
That's why
yeah,
you might want to ease into it too, because you don't want to be like some people who you go in and you're so angry with people and you have no patience because you're hungry. That's why I recommend easing in, so that way over time it gets easier because charity's number one. So fasting allows us and accompanies us with prayer and almsgiving and other works of charity. It's not an end of itself. You're very right to say it's a means to an end, and like any other means, it needs to be used carefully, understanding what the church teaches on it, how it's to be used, and then putting it to practice. Like you wouldn't just say, "Yeah, I really need to get healthy. I'm just going to go run a marathon tomorrow." Like that's what I'm going to do. So you're going to ease into it if you've never ran before. So same thing too with fasting. You should. I think everybody should, but it takes time and it takes discipline, and you build up to harder fasting over time. And that's the case definitely in my own experience. And people who I've recommended this to over time, they build it up over time, especially in the modern world where it is so frequently not talked about, especially even in the church, not known. This book, priests tell me 90% is new to them. So you're not the only one to say, I learned a lot, I didn't know about this. It's not taught. It's an untold history that I want more people to know and to love and to live. Um, but you have to take it in over time to restore it in your own life and your own family, and then you'll find and reap those benefits, not for the end in themselves, but as the means to grow closer to God.
awesome. The last question that I ask guests, because we're coming up on time, is it doesn't have to be related to the topic that we've discussed today. So this doesn't have to be related to fasting, but just whatever your top recommendation to men today is. I just like to ask every guest, as I mentioned, kind of for like the last question of, what would your recommendation be as the men who are listening to this are trying to grow in holiness, trying to grow closer to the Lord. And again, it can be related to fasting or
Right.
just whatever is top of mind for you.
So, something I see a lot. So, I'm the president of catechismclass.com. So, I focus a lot on religious education with families, with parishes, with everybody. And I think there's great crisis, obviously, in the church today in knowing what the faith really is. But I think that the number one thing I would tell men is not only do you need to learn the faith, but you have to live it out, because everybody learns by example. And I could teach a great lesson on here's what the church teaches on the Mass and on the sacrifice. But if you don't see it lived out in the parish and you go to irreverent masses, you're going to say it's not real. I don't believe it. Same thing too is, you learn in the faith and it's not practiced in the home life. There's no charity at home. There is no responsibility. There's anarchy. If you don't live out the faith in a charitable sense, if you're not praying the rosary, for instance, if you're not praying together, if you don't make the commandments of God and the commandments of the church the number one and other things subordinate to that, and you're like, oh, it doesn't matter. We're going to a football game today. We're going to skip mass. It doesn't really matter. Or, we're going to somebody else's house. It's Friday. Who cares? We'll just eat the meat that they prepared. Like, if you're giving into these, you are not living your duty as a man to lead by example. So, number one thing is to know the faith, to spend time studying it, to spend time learning it. And there's great catechisms and resources for that. You have to be in the driver's seat, though. You have to do that. It's a lifelong responsibility. But two, you need to transmit that, not just by word and sharing what you've known, which you do need to do, but also by the example. Because if you don't lead by example and live it out, it will really all be for nothing. And it will actually be to the detriment of God's glory, because people will say that we're hypocrites and we believe these things, but we don't actually practice them. So the practice of the faith in a home life and in a work environment is paramount importance. So every single day, what do you do? Do you start the day with morning prayer? Do you conclude with evening prayer? Do you make that examination of conscience to see that? But altogether, I would say that's the number one thing I would have men focus on. Fasting is a part of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching The Making of Man. If you like that and want more, click here. And don't forget to like and subscribe.